So I'm a long-time owner of the Canon RF 24-70 2.8 lens. I've enjoyed it for things like travel photography, portraits and studio photography. But despite how happy I've been with this lens, there's always been another in the back of my mind, and that's the Canon RF 28-70 F2. I've been meaning to compare these two lenses for a while. I'm somebody that respects the versatility and convenience of the 24-70 lens, but at the same time I love the shallow depth of field and rendering I get from something like a 1.2 prime lens. So I always wondered, is the 28-70 the perfect compromise? But then would the size and weight bother me? Would I miss the extra 4mm at the wide end? And of course, is it worth that high price? So today we're going to compare rendering, background blur, we'll look at 24mm versus 28mm, and we'll also take a look at the handling of the Canon RF 24-70 2.8 versus the 28-70 F2. I wanted to spend the day comparing both lenses wide open at various focal lengths I typically find myself using on a standard zoom lens. To test the lenses out, we went to a nearby deer park on what turned out to be, unfortunately, one of the windiest days of the year. Now here's a look at both lenses at their widest focal lengths and widest aperture. I shot these in landscape orientation so you can see how much more you get in the frame at 24mm. You capture a little more drama at 24mm, whereas at 28mm you get a little more separation thanks to obviously the f2 aperture, but also a little extra compression at the cost of a tighter field of view. Let's move on to some mid-length portrait comparisons starting at the widest focal lengths again on both lenses. Now here's a look at 35mm on both lenses. Again, showing the extra separation you're getting on the 28-70, which I really like here. The rendering of this lens reminds me of the RF 35mm 1.8 prime lens, which is impressive considering this is just a zoom. Now at 50mm, I actually think you're starting to see the differences in background blur lessen, but you be the judge. Here's the shots. At 70mm, again, I think the differences become a little harder to notice in terms of background separation at least. But how do these zooms stack up against something like a 1.2 prime lens? I decided to compare the two zooms, both at 50mm against the RF 50mm 1.2 prime lens. Here's all three shots together, showing you the amazing amount of background separation you get from the prime. I went on to repeat the comparison, now on some full-length shots, showing the increased separation from the faster f2 and especially f1.2 lens. Despite the amazing 3D pop you get from the prime lens, I really like the RF 28-70 shot here as a great in-between. 1.2 is probably a bit too much for this shot. In terms of sharpness, all three lenses are excellent, but the RF 50mm 1.2 is noticeably the best performer. It's a much harder call between the two zoom lenses, and looking through all the images of the day at various focal lengths, if I had to choose a sharper lens, it might be the 24-70. But it really is too close to call, and resolving power shouldn't be a deciding factor when choosing between these two lenses. Now we took a walk to find somewhere I could test the two lenses on a busier background. I found a distracting background to put the two lenses to the test, starting with the 24-70. And now the 28-70. The 28-70 melts the background in a really nice way. The extra blur is to be expected, sure, but the rendering of the bokeh here is really, really nice. I guess this is what people mean when they describe this lens as prime-like. In terms of handling, the 2870 is a significantly heavier lens. Despite this, it felt pretty good on the R5. The weight is distributed fairly evenly throughout the build of the lens, so thankfully it's not too front heavy, unlike the RF 85mm 1.2. The RF 2470 on the other hand is a joy to use, especially after enduring the weight of the 2870. It's comparatively light, and its smaller size means the zoom ring is much easier to use. The overall size of the 2870 for me is probably the biggest negative. Whether it's the larger zoom ring, the 95mm filter thread, or the fact that it doesn't fit nicely in all my camera bags. A standard zoom for me is a lens I want to be able to take anywhere, and the smaller size and weight of the 2470 makes me more inclined to do so. Now, before we lost the last of the light, we decided to get a few more shots with each lens around the grounds. I just wanted to get more of a feel for both lenses in a normal shoot. Starting with the 2870. Again, these 35mm shots really reminded me of the RF 35mm 1.8 prime. The faster aperture of this zoom allowed me to keep my ISO lower as we were losing light. Now switching over to the 2470, where despite having to use a higher ISO and losing that faster aperture, these shots actually probably turned out to be my favourite of the day. These shots are examples of how versatile a lens like this is. I can capture a wide shot and go straight into a close-up. And with the last of the light gone, we ended the day there. So, closing thoughts on the Canon RF 2870. I don't own the lens, I just rented it for the purpose of the comparison and got to use it for a few hours over that weekend. But did it live up to the hype? For me, it did. It actually probably exceeded my expectations. Sure, my thoughts are based on the limited time I got to use the lens, but for me the results speak for themselves. Online you see this lens described as having a prime-like rendering, and I really found that to be true. Considering this is a zoom, the rendering really reminds me of something like the RF 35mm 1.8 prime, maybe even better. I found it had a more pleasing background blur and was probably a little bit sharper too. Personally, I'm not going to be buying this lens though, simply because I already have a few 1.2 prime lenses I use and love for portraits all the time. If I was new to the RF mount, I think the 28-70 offers an incredible foundation to build upon, and I think it would make an amazing first lens. You cannot argue with the versatility and the quality that it's going to give you. Having said that, I would definitely recommend renting it first and spending some time with it, because for some people, the size and weight of this lens is going to be a deal breaker. My 24-70 is still probably one of my favourite lenses to use, however. It's an amazing, versatile performer that's comfortable to use and carry. The extra field of view you get at the wide end really lends itself to things like travel photography and videography. The stabilization for video is also incredible, and it probably has the fastest autofocus of any lens I've ever used. But what do you think? Which of these two lenses would you pick up? Or would you go another route entirely and pick up something like a few of the smaller RF 1.8 prime lenses? Let me know down in the comments. Hopefully this video helped you in some way if you are trying to decide between these two lenses. If there's any other lenses you want me to compare in a similar way, then let me know down in the comments and I'll do my best to put that together. I'm really looking forward to using the 28-70 a little bit more in the future. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.